Hi, I'm Kara Swisher. I am one of the editors at Recode, and I do all kinds of things. I want to welcome you here to this thing called Tech Odyssey. It sounds pleasant, but tech isn't very pleasant these days, so it's more like a hellscape. So we're going to talk a little bit about AI and a bunch of other things, a bunch of stuff. So what I'd love to do is each of the panelists introduce themselves. And we're going to get started on a wide range of topics. We're going to focus a lot on AI, but there's all kinds of topics. And luckily, as usual, tech has provided us with some vexing legal problems just today and yesterday, with a lot of controversy around YouTube and removing extremist content off of it. It's only been going 14 years, so they just realized there was some problematic content on it. And they seem to be, in the words of Gizmodo, flailing about like a giant noodle on how to figure it out. And it's largely because, actually, right now, YouTube, unfortunately, is run by the legal department and not by people who have sensibilities, editorial sensibilities. Although I do have to say that the CEO, Susan Wojcicki, is quite earnestly trying to figure it out. It's just very extraordinarily difficult, given all the ethical and legal quandaries they face. But it's an issue shared by Facebook, Twitter, and others. And my point of view is that they've largely abrogated their responsibility in this and now find themselves up to their eyeballs in ethical and societal and legal problems because of what they're doing on their platform. So I'd like each, starting at the end, everybody introduce themselves and sort of talk about what they do in particular, and then we'll get started, and things they think are most important concerning right now with tech and legal issues.
Sure. I'll be quick. I'm Ben Weisner. I've been at the ACLU for 18 years. I now direct our project on speech, privacy, and technology, which is an interdisciplinary team of mostly lawyers, but a couple of computer scientists too, looking at issues at the intersection of human rights, civil liberties, and development in new technology. The relevance of AI to our work is really everything. I've said to everyone in the ACLU, not just on the technology team, you might not be interested in AI, but it's interested in you.
Yes, it is.
So I'll leave it at that.
And some of the issues beyond AI, of course, is obviously facial recognition.
Sure.
And some others.
Yeah, I mean, we've been trying to prod the Fourth Amendment into the 21st century. We were counsel in the Carpenter case last year, where the Supreme Court narrowed the third-party doctrine for the digital age and basically said that, narrowly, that if the police want to track your cell phone location, they need a warrant, but more broadly, that we don't waive our privacy protection by using the technology that everybody uses.
Absolutely. Next, Rebecca.
All right. Hi, I'm Rebecca Kruchoff. I'm a legal scholar, and I focus on the interaction between law and new technology, how both push the other one to evolve, how both constrain the evolution of the other one. I come to this work from a background in human rights law and law of war issues, where I started off being really interested in how new weapons technology, cyber warfare, autonomous weapons systems were really pushing on fundamental principles of the law of war and just all the changes that were happening in that space.
Great. I'm Frank Taurus. I work at Microsoft. I started at the company with the primary responsibility of working with the privacy, consumer, and civil liberties advocates, continue that work, but soon got involved in the privacy issue. That was what I was doing when I was at Consumers Union prior to joining Microsoft. And that continues to this day, very important. The company supports and has supported for many years the notion of a federal comprehensive privacy law. In this day and age, though, we're very concerned that it doesn't muck up what a lot of the states are now looking at, and California's passed. We were one of the first companies, if not the first, to comply with the GDPR and extend some of those rights to our users everywhere. But then lo and behold, we had this thing, call it what you will. It was, at one point in time, it was big data, and then it kind of, you skip over machine learning and go right to this thing called AI and the many, many buckets of issues that is, or that contains. And all of a sudden, all these sorts of ethical issues come up, and certainly a challenge for companies like ours. Fortunately, we have great leadership with Satya Nadella and Brad Smith, who get the trust in our users. Both our enterprise customers and our consumer customers is paramount. Importance of working with a bunch of different stakeholders, including policymakers, in how to sort out the challenges, not to run away from them, but, as Brad Smith said recently, it's, with a market share, with a company the size of ours, we also bear some responsibility for figuring out the issues and making some hard choices. We've sued the federal government on several occasions and have engaged in some difficult conversations on issues like facial recognition with the civil liberties and other advocates, and we'll continue to try to work together to sort these things out. So lots of issues to talk about, lots of challenges ahead of us.
And I will note, Microsoft was involved in a trial many years ago, and it was sort of in the crosshairs. Yes. And in fact, Microsoft has become one of the more responsible members of the tech industry. You tend to mush them together, but there are differences. You can't mush Facebook and Microsoft together in any way, and Microsoft has shown itself to be a very responsible member in these issues, which is a real shift under previous administrations.
So good morning, I guess it is. My name is Roy Austin, and I am a partner at Harris Wiltshire and Grannis. But in the past, what I consider myself is actually a reformed prosecutor. I spent a long time as a prosecutor for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, and then as an AUSA, Assistant United States Attorney in Washington, D.C. And then I went on to the White House, where I was the Deputy Assistant to the President for the Office of Urban Affairs, Justice, and Opportunity. I don't believe that office still exists, in case anybody was wondering. And there I dealt a lot with the intersection between civil rights and criminal law, working with both DOJ and a number of other agencies. And my focus is largely on kind of predictive policing and the use of AI by law enforcement in their efforts to remove race and other classifications from their work, their unsuccessful efforts, I should say.
Yeah, that's a very important issue right now, because we'll talk about this a lot, because I feel like they shouldn't do any predictive policing right now, given the current data sets that are available. And we'll talk about the idea behind something called dirty data, which is most of the police data is dirty. Very simply put, black people commit crimes. We have to watch for black people. By the way, black people commit crimes. Look, see, they commit crimes. It just goes into an endless circle, and it's wrong. And it will be in a black box that we don't see, which is the way a lot of people like it, actually. All right, so let's get started talking about these issues. I'd love for each of you to talk about the idea of where we are right now in terms of understanding what the implications of AI. I feel like we're still dealing with the implications of social media right now, which are small compared to what's going to happen with AI, given all the power that it has. We can look to two different systems, I think. The one we have here, which is somewhat chaotic and mostly run by two companies, Google and Facebook own most of the AI developers, of the key ones, and China, which is obviously moving heavily into AI, which is a very different system, which is using quite a lot of these data sets to control the population, which they have to. They have a massive population, and a lot of their money, I just was on a panel with someone, an expert in China, a lot of their money is spent on internal surveillance of their citizens because they have to keep them under control. And AI is a wonderful way to do that. So I'd love to each of you talk about where you think we are. Let's stick with the first one, what's happening in this country and Europe and other places. Ben, why don't you start?
Well, sure. I think the first thing I will say is that the conversations that are going on around this issue are encouraging. And one of the reasons why we have such a terrible internet, I think, is that when this predominant business model was taking hold, we were not having these conversations, in part because I think Silicon Valley was so successful in saying it's too early for regulation, you're going to stifle innovation. And then almost in the next breath, it's too late for regulation, you're going to break the internet. And so what we got is an internet that was really built for the benefit of the corporations. We hear a lot now about surveillance capitalism because of Shoshana Zuboff's book, but it's a term that's been in play in our community for a long time, and also obviously for spy agencies like the NSA and its counterparts. And so now, I feel like you can't be in our space for more than a week without being invited to an AI ethics conference or some multi-stakeholder process or something. But I actually think these conversations are going on not just in civil society, but also within the companies. There are some encouraging multi-stakeholder processes going on, like the partnership on AI. We're beginning to see some rumblings on Capitol Hill, which is both a good sign and a bad sign. But I do think that we are having these conversations at a time where it's not too late for us to have a significant impact in putting some guardrails in place on the development of AI.
Okay.
Look, we're in a very bad place when we talk about AI and discrimination, because we basically exactly what you said is that none of this stuff was regulated. We now have, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 police departments. Each one is right now using AI the way it decides it wants to use AI. There's no regulation on it. There's no control over it, and there's no transparency on what algorithms are being used. And they basically are saying that we're using it in a way to prevent discrimination because we don't plug race in. But exactly as you noted, the data that they're basing everything they do on is awful in every way, shape, and form. It is based on the same discriminatory data that they use right now, and it's just guessing. Is all that they're doing is they're guessing, but using a computer to help them guess, and it's an enormous problem. And then we look at the use of body cameras now, and where is that data going to go, and who's going to use it, and how is it going to be used, and when is it going to be used? We look at the issues of where do you send your officers? That's a huge problem. And then just discrimination in general across the use in hiring is another area that I've looked at. In basically across the board in housing and everything else. We're using technology as an excuse to supposedly not be discriminating when in fact we don't have the data, we can't be using it right now for the things that we're saying. And then you just look at national security as well, and huge problems on who do we trust to be looking at this data, to be making these decisions. Can we predict human behavior based on past human behavior? And I think right now the answers are no, but we're just going headlong into this world.
On that front, in terms of discrimination, there's some use of it in recruitment, absolutely. And one of the things that one of the applications of AI was to take a picture, watch your face while you're doing an interview, and then map it with their top performers. And if your face matches with their top performers, you get hired or you have more of a thing. And let's guess who their top performers are. And you only have one guess. And so it's it goes into a lot of ways. And in some ways, it seems like a really helpful tool because humans always make bad choices or often make bad choices. But it does map onto previous ideas.
Yeah, they're using gaming too.
Gaming.
They have people play games. They say, here are our best performers, play this game. They perform a certain way on the game, and then they say, okay, we're going to present this to everybody else, and whoever performs the same as the best performers are the people who get hired.
Okay.
So it's actually a great question, and I look at it in a few different ways. One is kind of what are the atmospherics? What has changed between now and then? And I think Ben's exactly right in terms of a lot more people are aware. We're at in some, AI's been around for a while, but we're at a point now where we can actually impact policies and potentially practices moving forward. I mean, we've got employees from all the tech companies who speak up. I mean, trust me, at Microsoft, I'm pretty sure they all have Brad Smith's email and phone number, the same with Satya Nadella, and they don't hesitate to let our leadership know if they're having issues with the way things are going and the policies or positions that we're taking on. Certainly there's a greater understanding, at least amongst some members of the Hill. We've got folks like Will Hurd, who we've spoken to on a number of occasions, just a really bright guy, computer science background, same with folks like Senator Warner and a few others, and actually on both sides of the aisle, so really smart folks there. We've got this, I want to call them, because I feel old, but we've got a new group of scholars coming up that are really challenging ways, like I think it's Lena Khan is her name, the Yale law student.
She's now working for the House.
Who's working for the House, who looked at like novel ways of looking at antitrust. We've got people that are thinking creatively. Kara, I love what you said, but I think it applies not just to government, but to all of us. We need to be creative in the way we think about these issues. I think you said creatively proactive.
Oh, that was in the column in the New York Times, yeah.
And so I think we're at that point where there's enough kind of critical mass, but how do you bring people together to figure out the solution? So that's in front of us. On the issues, certainly bias and discrimination is important. I mean, there's certain cases where AI just should not be used. Either it's not ready yet or perhaps should never be used. The partnership on AI just came out with a report looking at a California law that basically said, if I get this correctly, like, courts, you must use predictive AI in the way you go about sentencing. And it's like, wait a minute, no, it's not, it's nowhere near ready for that. I mean, it's worse than crap in, crap out. I'd use, if we weren't being taped, I'd use a different, stronger terminology there. It's just with Microsoft, we said on facial recognition, a law enforcement agency in California said, hey, we hear about AI, this stuff is great, facial recognition, great, let's use it. It's like, no training, no nothing, but we're going to use it for body cams, so real time. It's like, no, it's not ready for that. Somebody else may sell it to them, but we are not. And actually, it's my understanding that they came back and said, well, thank you for calling that stuff out. Whether or not they actually go about using it, I don't know, but at least you've got folks calling the questions. I'm hoping other companies are kind of doing the same thing. I think, so bias and discrimination is a big issue. Certainly Maxine Waters on the Hill is raising this. I've told our folks, any issue that comes up on the House side on AI, bias and discrimination is going to be part of the conversation. We need to be ready for it. I think there's also manipulation. There's conversations going on now about deep fakes, dark patterns, those sorts of things. We'll call it Cambridge Analytica, whatever. We need to figure out how to respond to that. I laugh. If you walk on the streets of DC and run into somebody and say, are you working on privacy principles or principles around AI? 9 out of 10 people will say yes. But the question is, for our companies, and I used to get this when I first started at Microsoft, it's like, Frank, Microsoft came up with these privacy principles. This is great. I'm an engineer. How do I code for this? I'm like, I'm not an engineer. I don't have any idea. And so you work to figure it out, and we're going through that same process. We put out a book called The Future Computed that had these great principles in it, and some of us sat there and go, okay, this is great. We need to lay the groundwork, but now what do? We need to figure out how to operationalize these principles within the company, and we're going about doing that. And so there are lots of pieces to this puzzle, but we need to be smart about it and just, I tell people, exercise common sense. If you think something is not quite right, whether you be external to Microsoft or internal to Microsoft, I spoke to a group of consumer advocates. I'm like, give us a shout, call it out, talk to Kara. I don't, but let's kind of work together to solve these sorts of issues.
All right, so I'm going to zoom out a little bit to the international conversation around AI and the narrative and the rhetoric there. It's being formed right now, and the bent that it's taking is really dangerous. So the rhetoric around AI in the security space is that we're in an arms race, right? Like, have you seen that headline somewhere, right? Like, we need to worry about this.
Largely, right?
China and Putin has really contributed to this, right? Saying that the first country that develops AI is going to rule the world. And that's not true. We already have AI. But this is a really dangerous rhetoric because it creates this sense that even if we wanted to develop safe AI, because I'm concerned about malicious uses, malicious actors, different kinds of problematic uses, as well as all the discrimination problems that other people have talked about. But if we're going to take the time to develop safe and non-discriminatory AI, if that's possible, if we take the time to do that, Russia and China are going to develop AI faster, better, and then it's going to rule us. So we can't waste our time on these like froofy social issues because we need to worry about war. This is not accurate. This is not a good conversation, but it's what's happening. And so one of my concerns is that we need to start changing the narrative around AI. If you're law students, you're really familiar with the prisoner's dilemma, right? Both people cooperate or both people don't cooperate, or one cooperates and one doesn't. The national security community is really concerned about those spaces of, we take time to worry about safe AI, but other countries don't. And so we've got to think about how to make these other options look more attractive and how to build the norms towards those other options. And organizations like OpenAI are really concerned with this problem and doing a lot to build the conversation there, to change the stakes so that cooperation looks a lot more attractive than, building safe AI, I'm mixing my metaphors, looks a lot more attractive than not. And so part of it also is just changing the rhetoric. instead of it being an arms race, well, there's a slight bent over towards a space race, right? Which would still had some arms issues involved in it, but was more about accomplishing a certain goal. Or you can change it even more to a gold rush, right? There's this question of how do we achieve this? In which case you get to think about other actors, right? Like the entity selling the shovels or building the infrastructure. There's a lot more opportunity there to concentrate on. There's just a whole wealth of different narratives that we could be developing and that are going to be critical for the development of safe AI.
Okay, great. So just before, you all mentioned a lot of different things. Just for people who are not techies particularly, I'm going to just define a couple of things, just so you understand the difference between AI, machine learning, and deep learning. I'm going to read, this is actually a very good explanation. AI, machine learning, AI means getting the computer to mimic human behavior in some way, and that is via huge data sets that they see over time, and then it could start thinking for itself. It's computers that you don't just tell what to do, like Google, get me this information, and then it gets it for you. It actually knows you, and all the services. You're using AI right now, whether you know it or not, when it starts suggesting things or it gives you suggestions. And so it mimics human behavior, but it's not really human. It's a different kind of human, I guess. It's a really smart human. It also can be very stupid at the same time in a way that humans do understand common sense in a way that computers do not yet, or may never. Then machine learning, it's a subset of AI. It's part of that, which is, it consists of techniques that enable computers to figure things out from the data and deliver AI applications. And AI applications can be numerous. It's like saying, what does the internet do? It's the same thing. AI applications could be determining weather information and taking it and understanding it, whether you should plan. It could be very good like that versus something which is predictive policing or something else. And then lastly, deep learning is a subset of machine learning that enables computers to solve more complex problems. And that's a critically important issue, because these supercomputers and quantum computing gets very complex. And it's everything from when we have self-driving cars when we have self-driving cars, we're going to need massive computing to understand how logistically the cars don't crash into each other. And you see it just a tiny bit in these coverage of Tesla and stuff like that. That's not really what's going to happen. It's the ability to move cars around properly in a city when they're all automated is a massive AI, machine learning, and deep computing problem. And so, it's a massive mathematical, and also where people move and people are, anyway, it gets really complicated. And the companies that are ahead of this really are going to be the trillionaires, people of the next era, which we will have trillionaires someday. Probably Jeff Bezos will be the first. But in any case, those are the important things. And then one thing she mentioned is OpenAI, which is most of the AI is done by Google and Facebook right now, and Amazon and Apple to an extent, and Microsoft. And then Chinese companies, obviously, and other companies across the globe. But that's largely the biggest players. But then there's a group called OpenAI, which holds most of the patents. It's an organization run by a bunch of techies. Elon Musk is involved, Sam Altman, and others. And
not anymore.
That's right. He left.
Elon Musk left.
He left. That's right. That's right. He did. He was one of the founders of it. And the idea was to get patents on AI so that it would be shared among, that it wasn't just that Google didn't own everything, essentially. And Elon's big thing was that they are evil and are going to try to do a Terminator-like. He has a lot of theories about a lot of things, but that's why he's actually somewhat correct on this one. And so that's the concept of it, is that he's doing it. And so you understand, they're still trying to figure out where the power is in this sector. And most people think it should be like the internet, available to everybody, that these technologies should be open. And that's what, is that OpenAI? That's pretty much what it was.
Yeah, and I would say they're particularly concerned with the development of safe AI.
Yeah.
So they want to be the first to develop general or strong AI, so AI that's can't just play chess really well or can't just play Go really well, but can do a lot of different things very well and can be used in different circumstances. And they want to do so in a way that doesn't ultimately destroy humanity.
Right. So I want to
Small
get, I do want to get to international in a minute, but let's talk about like what, so people understand what AI does, because it is sort of a, like, it's like air. It's like the internet. It's very hard. So each of you sort of give a concept of what it actually, a good example of something it does right now, or is hopeful that they'll do it. So why don't we start with the Microsoft guy?
Sure. So we talked about predictive policing and use in the criminal justice system a little bit, but there are other uses of AI. I would say if anyone here uses Waze or any sort of
Mapping
applications that help you figure out the quickest route or the shortest route to a place, that's based on AI. It's taking a lot of data and a lot of information coming from other users, in fact, and kind of figuring all that out. Things like Cortana at Microsoft to provide you recommendations, Alexa, Siri, call whatever the next thing is to help you out. Answer your questions in real time. All that's based on AI. At Microsoft, we have a big program called AI for Good, which includes a couple of different buckets. The two big ones for now, there's three big ones for now. One is how to use AI for humanitarian purposes in times of flood or drought, or how to use AI and the intelligence that it could bring to reconnect missing persons, to provide supplies, to predict what may happen in the future, which is another big area of AI, and that's hurricane predictions and the different modeling that comes up. That's all AI. I have a friend who's a former CFO of a big reinsurance company. He says, well, I guess, all the data crunching and underwriting that we do these days, perhaps using computers, that's kind of based on AI to help underwrite insurance policies. Another big bucket for us is AI in the environmental space. How do you become more energy efficient? How do you have smart buildings that know when people come in, how many people are in the building so they know when to turn the air up or down or off? And that sort of thing. That's all based on AI. So there's lots of beneficial uses. But then we have these other scenarios. AI in use in the military is very controversial. And what do we do about that? Automated weapons, the notion that you could just have some sort of robotic device just shoot people that it may identify as the enemy. Well, who determines kind of what, if you start thinking about the decision-making process that a human would go through, how do you program that into a machine in any way that makes that exactly right? So that there's use cases like that we need to be mindful of. Automated vehicles is another use that folks cite a lot, and that technology just needs to continue to develop. So there's things in use today that people say, wow, this is good, beneficial. Yeah, there might be some other things that may go on with it, but generally okay. And then a whole bucket of other uses, and that's where a lot of the concerns
And the point being is to have some sense of things that are already happening anyway in society in a very anecdotal and haphazard way, is to create efficiencies around food, there's all kinds of things. Anybody else?
Yeah, I just want to say first, it's so funny to come to DC and talk about self-driving cars. I don't know the last time you were on Amtrak. They haven't yet figured out how to do Wi-Fi on a moving train.
Yeah.
But one example that makes me very nervous of AI, and we're going to be publishing a report about this next week, is surveillance cameras. So we have millions of surveillance cameras in this country, and you probably don't spend a lot of time worrying about them. And that's rational. The reason for that is that that almost none of the footage that those cameras capture will ever be seen by a human being. Only if something happens will someone go into the computer, rewind it, and look in that footage. But in the overwhelming number of cases, this is footage. There aren't enough human beings to look at it, and until now, computers haven't been able to process it. So imagine this sleeping infrastructure waking up. Imagine that we now have the capability to program those cameras to essentially be robot security guards, so that they are trained to look for suspicious activity. Well, what suspicious activity? You could program that to be anything you want. Obviously, we should worry about discriminatory impact there. Who looks unfamiliar in this neighborhood that's going to trigger it? You're walking back and forth in this place. Are you loitering or are you casing the joint for something? But they're going to have enormous capabilities, not just those video cameras, but we now have the technology developed for war zones, but being tested over our cities for planes with wide-angle cameras to actually record entire cities in granular detail, providing what really is a surveillance time machine, the capability to rewind that tape and see what happens in every inch of that city, and again, also to track for suspicious activity. So it's this kind of, my colleague Jay Stanley likes to say, you know, if you lower the temperature of water from 40 to 35, you have colder water. But if you lower it from 35 to 30, you have ice. We are sort of at one of these inflection points for surveillance, I think, where if we don't put the right brakes on, we're going to lose the ability to feel like we can walk anonymously in public. We're going to have this infrastructure that already exists operating and feeling like digital checkpoints at every block.
And of course, the excuse is, if you're not doing anything wrong, what do you care? That tends to be the excuse you get from a lot of people. Anybody else? And then I want to talk about.
No, I'll just jump. Oh, sorry.
Please.
I was just going to. So I worked a little bit with a company, and we brought in a bunch of civil rights people to talk to them, and they were doing home security, and they used AI to determine person, not a person, because there's so many false alarms, and so you have it on your home camera, and you know, person, not a person. And so what do you do when you have person? Well, what they did when they had person was they then sent that video to a room with a bunch of security people, human beings, to then look at it and then determine whether or not that person was doing something that was suspicious. Well, they put up a picture of their entire group of security personnel, and it was all white men. And we're like, well, okay, there's a little problem here because they're the ones who are going to make the determination whether to call the police. And the person's like, well, why is that a big deal? I mean, these are all the most experienced people that we could find who do security. And we're like, well, because what they think is suspicious may not be what someone else does. And like, well, we're not trying to discriminate, so we don't want to pick people based on their race. We're like, well, you know what, actually we need you to pick some people based on their race because you have a room full of white men who are going to be determining in a certain community who are committing crimes and who are not. And that's a real issue. But it's this problem, and then we're also concerned that, you know, the next step is to do it as facial recognition. And I'll just throw out the other issue is, how long do you keep this stuff? So I never even thought about this. I'm like, body cameras, it's a great, great thing. And then I sat down with a bunch of Black Lives Matter individuals, and they were like, so you're telling me that the protest that I was in 5 years ago is going to be sitting in some police locker, and sometime they're going to roll that back, and then I'm going to be arrested because I was involved in some protest that happened 5 years ago. I mean, I want all of you to go back to your college lives and think about everything that you did in college right now. And one of my college classmates, Susanna Baruch, is in the back room, and I know she did some awful things in college. And now, some 30 years later, they're going to go back and they're going to roll the tape and they're going to be like, oh, I remember when you were doing that. I mean, that's what we're talking about in the world right now, because they can just hold this data forever, and whatever bad thing you did back when you were whatever is going to be used against you later on in life.
Right, I like how you throw Susanna under the bus, which is called deflection.
Right. Well, she did bad things. I did not. But she did.
Okay. All right.
You watched and judged her.
Yeah. I don't believe you.
I just want to toss out a couple. There are. It's really easy in these kinds of conversations to focus on all the negatives. But I mean, autopiloting in airplanes, a lot of it relies on AI. Diagnostic imaging is increasingly using AI to identify cancer and other issues in radiology. Cyber patches, right, finding issues in code and patching them. There's a host of beneficial uses. And the thing about technology, right, is it's always Janus-faced, right? So you always have the positives, and then you try and minimize the negatives. Just to talk a little bit about autonomous weapon systems and their use in war, since it's come up a little bit. We already have, and there have already been deployed, autonomous weapon systems that are capable of independently selecting and engaging targets without human intervention. South Korea has been using them these sentry robots on the demilitarized zone for years that actually use a sort of Samsung technology, the same thing in Dance Dance Revolution, to identify human forms and train a gun on the individual and say surrender or it will shoot. South Korea has been a little bit cagey about where or whether there's a human involved in that process, but certainly the capability is already there to have fully autonomous systems making decisions regarding lethal force. Adding AI into the mix is a different level, right? So the possibility for in-field learning and evaluating situations and gathering information, that adds a new X factor because you don't know necessarily how the system is going to react in a given situation, which really changes the risk calculus associated with it, particularly as the damage potential of the system goes up. So
she's talking about it also applies to self-driving cars. When a human has a car accident, for example, just the human learns and possibly makes the same mistake. I'm thinking of myself. I'm thinking of you, Roy, actually, in college. In self-driving cars, all the cars learn. Millions of cars learn when an incident. That's how they train. That's why they need hours on these cars to learn and learn and learn. And they start to really learn and don't make the same mistake again and again. The same thing, though, with weapons is that it happens when a human shoots someone, they learn. They learn very quickly.
Or they don't.
Often they don't, but many do. And in the case of a weapon system, the robots, which are powered by AI, do learn, and they learn that it's good, that it's not. They don't have any. It's not good or bad. It worked, and so there's no calculation, and you can't take a robot to trial at this point. You can't do those things. You just turn them off. But it infects the whole system and in a way that is really hard to pull back. And I think that they don't know. So let's talk about this. So the idea is there is good and bad. But as we've seen through recently with just social media, the bad tends to go forward very quickly, and the good, which of course we all like, calling an Uber, we all like doing this, we all like doing that, but much of what's going on discussion right now is the largeness and the bigness of these companies and the lack of any oversight over anybody who's developing this. And that's really one of the reasons why there's so much discussion about antitrust action against some of the big tech companies and others, because most of the people in charge, specifically at Google and Facebook, are unfireable. Mark Zuckerberg is unfireable. He controls the entire company, controls every aspect of it. He likes to pretend he doesn't, but he actually, they just had a thing to remove that power at Facebook's board meeting, and it was voted down by Mark Zuckerberg. So he's unfireable, and the board is useless on so many levels because they don't have any power over him. So it creates this situation of the idea of who are the stakeholders and who should be the stakeholders. And one thing the government has done is not intervened very much in tech at all. There's been almost no regulation of tech for recent tech for the past 20 years. And they're protected by lots of different laws, including something that's starting to get a big debate around Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. But there's all kinds of, tech has not been regulated the way chemical companies or Wall Street or media or any other thing. So you mentioned at the beginning, I think it was you, Ben, who mentioned talking about the idea of stifling innovation. It's a big argument that is made by Silicon Valley people I know, I listen to it all the time, is that if you don't let us do this, we're going to stifle innovation and China will get ahead of us. That's one of them. Or in general, you can't create things without breaking a lot of things. And if you remember Facebook's famous motto they're trying to get away from was move fast and break things. And it's interesting they choose the word break and not disrupt or change. It's break. And they've broken them, and now they can't fix them, kind of thing. It's a problem now, today. So I want to talk a little about this idea of stifling innovation, how you innovate and at the same time control, because I think it's a big debate. And I'll just reference a podcast I did with Mark about 6-8 months ago. It was a problematic podcast for him, mostly. Completely, actually. He said a lot of really stupid things. And there were so many, it was hard to pick. But the one I focused in on was his argument about China getting ahead of us if you don't let him do what he needs to do, or Facebook and tech do what they need to do, China will beat us. And I call it the Xi or me argument. Like it's him or me, and I'm like, and in the podcast I'm like, I don't like either of you. So what's my third choice? And so let's talk about that concept of what this idea of stifling innovation, and what are the other choices, and who should be at the table in making these laws, and who is at the table right now. So, you want to start? And then
Oh,
Ben.
sure. So I think there should be a DC drinking game every time somebody says stifle innovation. You have to take a shot. We'd all walk around drunk. I've heard the same thing for years. Have yet to see it actually happen, simply because there tends to be a lot of stakeholders around the table. Unfortunately, in this day and age, it takes sometimes a while for Congress to act. But then that leaves companies to kind of sort out what to do on their own, and more, I think other stakeholders are having a powerful voice. Certainly as the political climate changes, and particularly in certain bodies, they start to pay attention to a lot more diversity of voices, like what's going on in the House, and hearings on facial recognition. There's going to be hearings on use of technology in the financial services sector, and race and bias will be part of that discussion. I mean, I remember back in the day when we were first talking about privacy, it's like, oh, we can't pass a privacy law, that's going to stifle innovation, it's going to break things. Oh, you can't do access because we can't figure it out, that will break things, there's no way we can do that, we can't delete information, how do we do that, we can't sort that out, we can't figure this out, portability, we can't do that. And now all those things are just kind of a given. Like, that's the price of admission to the privacy discussion. Now name a company that's not for some version of privacy. I mean, for different reasons, and we won't get into all the details, but all of a sudden we can start to sort these things out. It's as people get their arms around exactly what they're doing, and that was a big problem early on, is some companies didn't have any idea what was going on. It's like, we can't be for anything because we just don't have a clue of what's going on, and so they hid behind this, you're going to stifle innovation. It's because they have no idea what their engineers are doing on the back end. So it's like, okay, we all need to be responsible about these things. So, listen, I can't speak for the other companies. For us, and I've heard our CFO say this recently, I've heard all of our execs say this recently, from the product folks on down. We just had a to-do out in a summit out in Redmond, and for the past several years, this thing has been growing, and you can always get the legal people on board with stuff. But to hear a product person say, hey, listen, we get it now. It's about user trust. We need to, these things are important to us. We can't say, stifle innovation anymore. We've got to figure out how we can do what we need to do to be a successful company, but do it in the right way. And you know what? Those two things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive.
Yeah, so a less loaded way of talking about the stifling innovation, and this is a line that I've even been guilty of using, although I've stopped myself recently, is that, we say, law just can't keep pace with technology.
Yeah.
Technology is fast and law is just so slow, and I really think it's exactly backwards, right? It's the obligation of innovation and technology to be consistent with our laws and our norms and our values. It's not the obligation of our laws and our norms and our values to somehow keep up with technology. And there's no industry that wouldn't have preferred to develop and innovate without having rules. Certainly the energy industry hates environmental rules. The drug industry doesn't like until they took it over, the FDA. But again, of course, anyone who is developing something for profit would prefer to be able to innovate without rules. But I just am not persuaded even in the least that the kinds of regulations that we've talking about that are not so sweeping would interfere at all with our ability to innovate in ways that we want people to innovate. Let's see some innovation in other areas. Where we'll probably talk about social media and content moderation. Let's see some innovation in user controls. Right? Let's see some innovation that goes beyond, should I mute you or should I block you? Why hasn't there been some innovation in how I can have a better, feed coming across my social media? There's all kinds of ways.
Do you want to know? They don't care, but go ahead.
Well, no, it's worse than that, right?
No,
it will cut into their profit.
Not really.
Right?
No,
they
don't care. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
I want to plus one all of that. One of my hobby horses is that most law governs most new technology most of the time. When you say like tech isn't regulated, no, most tech is, right? It's the
Automobiles are regulated.
automobiles are regulated,
Chemicals are regulated,
airplanes are regulated, and it's the rare exceptions that make the news, right, that promote this mistaken idea that law can't keep up with the technology when the vast majority of law is tech neutral, right? And the vast majority of norms is tech neutral. And you can have lots of innovation with tech neutral standards, right? The automobile industry has had this. It has plenty of safety standards that are tech neutral, that don't regulate how automobiles need to achieve certain goals. It just sets goals that need to be achieved or floors that can't be gone under. So there's lots of opportunity for regulation that actually can even spur innovation by requiring new safety. I'm just using safety as one of many things, but you can imagine any kind of social goal and set achievement bars that the technology has to meet. I do find it helps to sort of abstract out a little bit and recognize the different kind of conversations that happen over and over again. And one thing that we're sort of getting at here is the war between the precautionary principle and the procrastination principle. So Zittrain's procrastination principle is like, let's sit back, and he said this in the early days of the internet, so to be fair to him, let's sit back and see what happens with new technology and see what risks come up, and then we can regulate those risks as necessary. And the opposite side of that is the precautionary principle, which says when the risk is sufficiently great or the damage can't be remedied afterwards, we need to regulate ex ante. We need to jump in early and head off that risk before it happens. These are both valid points, and they're just going to be, which one is going to be most useful in a given situation is going to depend on the technology and the nature of the risk it poses, right? So my kids are really into fidget spinners right now. I'm not really worried about the risks there, right? I'm fine with the procrastination principle there. Social media, we're seeing a different sort of thing.
Okay. Did you want to say? So that brings us into the idea of who should then, I want to talk about what you think the laws should then be. But first, a little bit about who should be at the table in this and who is right now. Because right now there are a lot of, like you said, I've had myself been to several hundred AI ethics events because of what's been happening with social media. I think it's sort of getting people focused on it. Tend not to have things happen. But let's talk about who should be there, who should be participating in this, and who should be the leaders in it that cause, because right now the leaders are these companies who are not thinking about it. Google put together a very strange AI panel that didn't gel, that they had to close down. There's independent ones, there's companies have them internally, and then there's government people and there's citizens groups and things like that, and advocacy groups. So I'd love to know who you think, I want to start with you, should be part of the discussion around, especially around AI. Which stakeholders are the most important?
It's everybody, and I think that's the problem. Is everybody thinks that, or a lot of people think that you need to have a technology background to be at the table for a discussion about AI. But what I learned very quickly during my time at the White House is that you have to invite everybody to the table because everybody's a stakeholder in this. This is everybody's information, and it is amazing what ideas you get from people who do not have a heavy tech background. When you're talking about it's their information, it's their lives that are being affected day in and day out. And if you don't give them a voice at the table, you're never going to learn this stuff. And so to me it is, how do you create, one thing you have to create is you have to create transparency. So you cannot have these algorithms being done in secret, because if you don't know what's behind the equations that are being run, you're never going to know how they get to the conclusion. You can't just throw people conclusions and say, oh, AI told us that this is how it's supposed to work, so this is how it works. Second thing is you have to create groups of people. So in predictive policing, I need law enforcement at the table. I need average folks at the table. I need business at the table. I need formerly incarcerated at the table. I need all those people at the table when I'm even talking about predictive policing, because it's all of these lives that are going to be affected. We tried this thing I was working on a project on big data and discrimination with DJ Patil. And
He's the former chief information officer.
correct, first ever chief information
We don't have
officer.
any now.
Yeah, we have
We
no
don't have,
information.
we have no chief technology officer, we have no CIO.
Yep.
We sort of have a science and technology person.
It's Jared Kushner.
Yeah. No, there's another guy.
Oh, okay.
I think he was in real estate.
Information's overrated.
Yes, exactly.
Let's just hope there's no Ebola, that's all I have to say.
But
It's really disturbing.
the thing that I want to say is what we were talking about is that no one who gets a data science degree right now has to do a data science and ethics piece of it.
Right.
And how important or how awesome would it be that to get a data science degree, you have to go through an ethics course? So all these data scientists are learning about the possible, like there's a lot of good that comes with AI and we all enjoy that, but so much bad can happen and has happened. How do we start creating that as part of the conversation?
The
from
ethics issue is funny. I wrote a column in the Times about a year ago saying we should have chief ethics. I was just trying to fuck with Silicon Valley, really. I wanted them to think about it because they're never going to hire them, and that person's just going to be a PR, the way they do the diversity stuff. It's just PR for the most part, from what I can tell. And so the concept was that education should have a really significant element, not just a sort of one of those courses that nobody cares about, that it should be woven throughout the curriculums of these schools, which I think is really more to the point. Talking about who should be in the stakeholders?
Sure. So I agree with all of that. I mean, so you can think about, internally, who should be at the table for us at Microsoft, sitting on what is essentially our ethics committee. It's called Ether. We've got people from everywhere in the company, and the discussions become fascinating. We've got, folks from the research department who just think very long and hard about the implications of technology on society, what it means for populations, really truly the impact, to the salespeople who go, oh, wait a minute, that means I can't sell to this particular government. Like, I'm under quota. What does that mean? And so it forces the question, like, how do we sort this out as a company? So just from that learning experience, we need everybody needs to have a seat at the table. But what I find sometimes is we've got policymakers, even the ones with the best intentions, know enough to be kind of dangerous. And then we've got all these technical experts who speak a completely foreign language, can't understand like what they are talking about half the time, but these are the leaders in the field. How do we work to bring those people together so we know what's in the realm of reality of both what's happening with the technology and what is possible, and then start to forge the policy around that? So. And it's going to take a lot of newer voices too. I go back to the creativity. I think it's going to take creativity and common sense. My big belief is, and we're working on this, in different ways at Microsoft, is who gets to be the person at whatever level to raise their hand in the room and say, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't do that. We can do it for sure, and maybe there's no legal reason why we can't. But should we do this? And I think that may hold true for this group of stakeholders, right?
I have an upcoming comment. I call it the Black Mirror exercise. If you can figure out a Black Mirror episode with what you're making, you shouldn't make it.
I'm going to borrow that.
Right?
I love that.
Like,
That's
come
awesome.
on.
That's awesome. But
No, this could do this. Like,
Let me push back on it for a second here. I suspect Microsoft looks a lot like pretty much every other company.
Yeah.
Having everyone from Microsoft at the table is not having everybody at the table.
Right.
Oh,
And I think
I'm
too
not
many
suggesting. I'm not
Oh,
suggesting that.
Right, but I'm
at
just
all.
saying
Yeah,
that
I'm not suggesting that. at all.
that's a big problem. Is we think, oh, well, we'll bring up diverse voices from our company. We'll bring up the CEO and the CFO, and we'll have some other executive, and that's what too many companies think is everybody at the table. That's not that's not everybody at the table.
I wasn't suggesting that at all. My point was a larger one, just saying having the diversity of voices in that particular instance for our company, to me, shows the need for the diversity of larger voices, not just Microsoft, but the larger diverse communities, especially the communities that are impacted. It's like, why aren't we asking the people that will be most impacted by the technology what their feelings? I mean, they may not be technologists, but and not enough of that is happening, I think. So,
they never get
sorry,
asked.
I didn't mean that.
Largely,
I wanted to
again,
clarify.
because they never get asked about anything else, but that's another issue. So I want to get anything else who should be. I want to talk about what the laws should then be. What if you could wave your wand, like what should be the two different regulations or laws or actions that should be taken now, if you could just make it happen without the difficulty of all having to agree with each other. And then we'll get to questions from the audience. So each of you, I'd love, Ben, why don't you start? What would
Sure.
what do you think is critical to have in place for around AI and other advanced technologies?
I mean, I want to start by saying that there's plenty of law in place. And so already, when AI runs up against substantive legal rights, we're going to get inside some of these black boxes. So I'll give an example. My ACLU colleagues in Idaho learned that the local Health and Human Services Department was using AI, using algorithms in order to calculate people's Medicaid benefits, and people were having their benefits reduced for reasons that were completely obscure to them. And through litigation, again, relating to the substantive rights, they were able to pry into that, see the algorithm, expose it to an expert, and establish what was going on. And we'll see this in the criminal justice system. If an algorithm is being used to decide whether you get bail or not, the length of your sentence, a company shouldn't be able to say, this is proprietary, if we have to show it to you, it'll hurt our business. If what's inside of that is deciding whether you're going to be free or whether you're going to be incarcerated. So I think really step one here is to absolutely demand more transparency and visibility into the operation of algorithms that affect our substantive legal rights.
To transparency. So.
Transparency is huge. And so, one thing my friends at the Knight Institute at Columbia have been pushing Facebook to essentially open up their algorithms that determine what news you're going to get in your feed.
That's been a big push, is
Right.
the idea that right now there's never been, this is an antitrust issue, there hasn't been a new social network since 2011, and that was Snapchat. And basically Facebook gets all its product innovation from Snapchat. It's just Evan Spiegel's its chief product officer, as far as I can tell. And so one of the issues is if you open up some of these information, there can be new social networks created using the information on Facebook. That's one of the suggestions. Obviously, Facebook does not like this idea that much, but may be forced to do so.
Right. I mean, one area where, obviously it won't surprise you, I don't think we need law, and I don't think it would be constitutional anyway, is around, enforcing content moderation. Mark Zuckerberg wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post where there was this almost throwaway line saying, government, we need you to help us decide what content should be allowed on the network. He later clarified he meant outside the United States where there is no First Amendment.
Right.
Right. Inside the United States, that actually would clearly be unconstitutional. I also think that focusing on the content moderation end, when considering the scope of the problem that these social networks create, is like trying to deal with rising oceans by bailing with
Right.
a bucket.
That line was because he's like, I've just made a big mess here.
Yeah.
That's what he was doing.
Right.
You take it.
Right.
Even though I made it. Go ahead, next.
All right, so both of my changes would be more to norms than to law. One is David Dinks made the point that computer science has developed as a profession and data science has developed as a profession in a way that's not professionalized in the same way that doctors are, that lawyers are, that engineers are. And one way of integrating ethics into the programming is to professionalize it. So to change the norms around the training, to have a sort of professional ethos, to create a sense of duty and obligation that's larger than serving your immediate client's interest or trying to answer this one really interesting question. The flip side of that, on the other side, the other thing I'd like to change is developing pre-publication norms for AI research. Right now, the MO in AI is outside of Google and Facebook is publish everything, share everything, make everything open. And you can see why that's beneficial, right? Everybody is on the same page, and what's available to one is available to all. But the problem with that is exactly what you call the Black Mirror problem, right? Mm-hmm. Is that people are not considering the potential malicious uses of what they're publishing. And so they're not thinking about the second order effects or how it can be employed in dangerous ways. And so creating pre-publication norms that require the researchers to actually think through what are the possible accidents that might occur, what are the misuses that might occur, what are the malicious uses that might occur, before publishing and coming up with a structured way of what gets published and what doesn't. And
It's a
at different
scenario building
levels.
concept, the idea of scenario building.
Yeah. And that exists for biotechnology, and that exists for cybersecurity, but that doesn't really exist in the AI community right now.
Because they're super optimistic, that's why. No, I'm kidding. I actually was in a meeting. I find them just stupid. I was in a, I tell this story a lot, but I was in a meeting when Facebook Live came out, and they were showing it to reporters. And it was some pretty significant people at the table, and they showed it, and we're all like, isn't this cool? Cool, cool. You know, cats, whatever the heck. Or your mom, or, you know, some Chewbacca mom, whatever the heck, if you remember her. And so I was sitting there, I'm like, I put my hand up and I said, what are you going to do when someone murders someone on this? What are you going to do when someone bullies someone? What are you going to do when someone commits suicide? What are you going to do when, say, a crazy person puts a ham on his head and broadcasts a mass murder? What are you going to do? And literally 3 of the people in the room, the Facebook people, are like, you're a bummer. And I'm like, yeah, that's true, but this is going to happen. And then New Zealand, like, you know, and it's going to happen over and over again. And then they didn't have things in place to stop it fast enough, which is 17 minutes before they stopped it, which seems like a short time, but it isn't. And then it iterated, and so they didn't have systems in place to stop the iteration of people posting. It's because the systems were built to iterate these things. Once you take one down, you put one up. And so they built the systems to work exactly the way they did. And so those are the kind, they literally don't think of those things. I go into companies a lot of the time and say, oh, this could be bad, and this is why. You know, for Tinder, at one point I was like, what about the safety of women? What about this? And they're like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Like, it's really literally, they don't anticipate any consequences of anything. So go ahead.
Well, so that's why diversity and inclusion in
Yes.
the workforce is so important. If I see one more picture of, like, here's a group of coders and they're all white males between the ages of 18 and 25, kind of frat boyish, you're gonna go, okay, wait a minute, no. And so that's one thing. But so a couple of things. We've recently called for regulation of facial recognition, technology kind of being deployed today. Lots of serious consequences, need to start somewhere. We've done that. Related to what happened in Christchurch, the tragedy there, we joined with some other companies and with government officials who called for, they call it the Christchurch call. It's like, we all need to kind of work on solving this problem. We know it's going to be hard, but like, we're smart people. According to some of our folks, and I'm sure other company folks, like, we're the smartest people in the world. Like, okay, then let's work to figure this out. So this sort of thing, might not be able to prevent the underlying attack, but can definitely help curb some of the things that happened afterwards and react better. Working together, working individually as companies, and then look at what the government, appropriate government role is in getting to actually some of what are society's norms around some of these issues. We've been for, as I said before, passage of a comprehensive federal privacy law. My guess is it's going to include something around addressing bias and discrimination and the use of data, which will then bleed over, of course, into AI writ large, as well as transparency and accountability.
So in that, Stanford in the AI area, this thing I've written about, they launched something called the new AI Institute. It's called the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Stanford just launched their Institute for Human-Centered Intelligence with great fanfare. The mission, the creators and designers of AI must be broadly representative of humanity. 121 faculty members were listed. Not a single faculty member was black. 100 were white men. So that wasn't very diverse.
Nope.
They were old. That was diverse. Okay, go ahead.
And if I recall correctly, I think they heard about that.
They heard about it.
They heard about
They
it.
heard a little bit,
Yeah.
Yeah, but they didn't think, this is what I'm talking
Right,
about, consequences.
exactly.
They don't think of anything in advance. They literally can't. It's like that brain disease that was in that Drew Barrymore, you couldn't remember anything 5 minutes before. Like you know what I mean? Like, oh yeah, I forgot about that again. Sorry, go ahead.
I don't know what reference.
It was a movie with Adam Sandler and Drew Barrymore. It was on the other night.
50 First Dates.
Thank
It's a good
you.
movie.
My 14-year-old is watching it and laughing hysterically.
I was watching Dumb and Dumber.
It was delightful. You should watch it. And I don't like Adam Sandler in any way. So
So I'm going to we're going to create some red hats. We're going to walk around and it's going to say, make disparate impact great again. I mean, I think that's
No more
really
red hats.
the bottom line is that without disparate impact law, we're never going to be able to get to any of the bias and discrimination that is involved in AI, because and let's find some people to enforce it. But short of that, I don't know how you reach a lot of these issues.
So anything that you would pass, if you could speak?
We have to put teeth behind the civil rights laws that allowed for actually disparate impact analysis, because that's all we have. I mean, intentional discrimination is going to be harder and harder, and all these companies mean well, all these coders mean well, supposedly. So until you're able to actually analyze what is happening with what you're doing, you're going to be stuck.
Okay. All right. Questions from the audience about this? Please ask them. Do we have a thing? You don't have to get up. We can take it around. Put your hands up. Or can we take it off or not? Does it have to stay there? Why not? Yes. Okay. Sorry, you had such a... Oh.
Hi, my name is Alex Finkelstein. This question is mostly directed towards Frank. So Rebecca actually made reference to kind of an arms race, right, between sovereign states that are developing this technology and how they will implement regulation or a lack of regulation, and how that will lead to them being more or less successful, them winning the race. But there's a big battle in this country between Microsoft with Azure, Google with GCP, Amazon with AWS, those battles of cloud computing, big data services. How do you at Microsoft balance the need to protect privacy, the need to protect the consumer and their data, with trying to maintain and create a competitive advantage?
Well,
Just for people who don't know, these are cloud computing services. AWS sort of pulled really fast ahead initially because Google was using its stuff. Microsoft and Google have caught up, so it's become a much more competitive thing. This is cloud computing, which everything is stored there, essentially.
I mean, just the brief short answer is our view is our strong positions on privacy, not just what we promote in terms of policy, but our practices internally and what we do, the steps that we take to maintain the information, to protect the information, to file cases against the government if we need to. It provides us with a competitive advantage in that space. And so I think it's, privacy has gone beyond one of those kind of, it'd be great if we could do, to really we're seeing, almost a competitive advantage around privacy. Well, I shouldn't say almost. I think it's kind of there. The person in charge of our Privacy and Reg Affairs program, Julie Brilla, former FTC commissioner, talks about how we're actually, we're really competing on, we compete on privacy, so.
Okay, excellent, thank you.
That is a big issue. Apple obviously is doing advertising against it,
Yeah.
and Apple just announced its sign-in, which was a big, I'm not going to curse, but it's a big screw you to Facebook and Google, which is they're going to anonymize so you don't get tracked by Facebook and Google. So it's going to be used as a competitive thing. And in cloud computing, things are better because there's competitors. Even though they're large competitors, they're certainly opening up. And I have no doubt AWS has to be spun off.
Okay.
I think the government's going to force that one.
I agree.
Hello. Thank you all for hosting and being on this panel. My question relates to a company like YouTube.
Mm-hmm. Owned by Google.
Yeah, and is it, when it comes to regulating a company like that, should it be treated like just another private sort of organization, or should it be treated more like a public platform? And if it is going to be treated like a public platform, do we just fall back on free speech laws in our Constitution, or do we have to start from scratch when it comes to regulating speech on something as big as YouTube?
Lucky for you, I just wrote an entire column about this, about what is the public square. It is not the public square. There's 53 billionaires at Google. This is a very private square that you're getting charged for, and they're making a lot of money. So it's not a public square, and they have no public obligations whatsoever. Secondly, the Second Amendment it's not about free speech. It's about Congress shall make no law. First Amendment, sorry, the Second Amendment. All those amendments, sorry.
That's a
I was just reading a large gun control. There was a really interesting story about changing the Second Amendment. I'm sure that's just to freak out some people. The First Amendment is Congress shall make no law, not Facebook shall make no law, not YouTube shall make no law, not Google shall make no law. So it's a really problematic thing. And so they can regulate anything they want. They can make any rules. And I think the problem is they've jumped from rule to rule to rule like a giant, there's this noodle. They just go back. In just this course this week, they shifted back and forth on this Carl Amaza and Steven Crowder thing, I think at least 3 times.
Yeah.
And that's just whoever, I'm not sure what's happening internally, that they've caused them to shift. I have some idea, actually, including me writing them, what the fuck are you doing? Like, you need to stop this kind of thing, or whatever, whoever's doing it. Oh, I just cursed, sorry. Not sorry. But go ahead.
Yeah,
You would have a different opinion.
Look, I think this is right. I don't think people would be very happy with the results if we somehow decided that these huge monopolistic social media platforms were effectively constitutional public fora, because most people would not want the rules that that the First Amendment allows to apply to all social media. So, for example, companies would not be able to remove hateful speech. Hateful speech is completely lawful under the First Amendment. They wouldn't be able to remove pornography. Now, there's different ways of regulating it. Most people don't realize that Twitter allows pornography, but you have to go searching for it in order to see it.
They put it down.
Right. Yeah. There's ways that they can regulate it beyond on and off. I know that there have been some state court cases in California where people have tried to make the argument that that Facebook, for example, has become effectively a constitutional public forum. But I don't actually
Not just in this country. In the Philippines, it's 90% of news distribution.
Yeah, I don't.
Something like that.
I don't think that's right. I think these companies have their own rights under the First Amendment to decide what kind of communities that they want to create. I think the problem is that some of them are so large that the impacts, the footprints that they have are so huge, and I don't feel really any more comfortable with Mark Zuckerberg defining the boundaries of acceptable political speech than I do with Congress defining the boundaries of political speech. One is governed by the First Amendment, the other is not. But I don't actually see any way out of that conundrum except to have Facebook and Google not operate at such a huge level so that 80% of the people are not getting most of their political information from 2 private companies. And so more and more people like me who don't know a lot about antitrust are being attracted by it as just, well, we don't know what to do, so let's break things. But I don't think the First Amendment is going to be a lot of help in getting us out of this.
They'll probably break them up, and some people are arguing that they'll be more valuable broken up if they're different pieces that investors will have, and then there'll be real innovation because it unleashes innovation, and that does often create. Right now, you have a situation where 3 or 4 companies really are blocking innovation quite heavily, even by accident. So it's a big question. Probably antitrust is how it's going. Yes, I see the First Amendment. I've got it. My favorite is the 14th, but okay.
But also, I think we should acknowledge how hard this is.
Yes.
Right. So if you're going to have a model that allows hundreds of millions of uploads per day, it's a problem beyond human scale. And it's also a pretty hard problem for computers, right? With the YouTube takedowns, you see this. It's not so easy to train a computer to know the difference between content about Holocaust denial and content that denies the Holocaust, right?
Yeah, but they built it that way. That's the problem. They built it that way. It's operating exactly how they've built it. That's just they're not. This is not it's not a quirk of the system. It's how they built it, and they never thought of it, and therefore here we are with that.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions? Go ahead. Oh, go. Just have time for a few more. I've got to go do 3 big First Amendment podcasts. But go ahead.
Thank you. My question is generally just about education, and if we want to have everybody at the table, I often, when I think about regulating on a federal level or even a state level, any of these things, I think of the Senate committee hearings with Mark Zuckerberg and the questions that were asked, and the complete disconnect of so many people and what these things actually do. So how do we address that before, because we can't expect them to make
So you're just calling them
regulations.
stupid.
No, I
Right.
I
They
mean,
were.
maybe about some things, sure. Like, and I think
That
we
was
can all
really
be
bad.
humble enough to
Right, okay.
realize that. But how do we address that? Because I think we have to before we can get.
I personally think a
that.
lot of them, I spent a lot of time in Washington recently, I think a lot of them are much smarter than you think, and especially staff below it. I think there's a lot more intelligence than was displayed in those horrifying hearings. They were depressing on many levels. And that was just grandstanding, but there's at least a dozen senators who do understand it, and their staff is quite up on this, and I think there's some great, even though they've been in a slumber, like a Cinderella slumber for a long time, the FTC and the Justice Department have a lot of people who understand these issues and stuff from my perspective, but.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of, I'll just call them NGOs, advocates, are doing a great job of providing additional knowledge, I'll put it that way, to the members and their staff as our companies. I mean, a big wake-up call was, I'm dating myself, many years ago, when Congress decided they were going to do something about spam and spyware and malware. And so they all worked together and they introduced this bipartisan bill, and our engineers and engineers of other companies took a look at it and said, basically, this will muck up all of our efforts to combat these things exactly. So then it was like this big, massive education effort as to how the technology works, what's in the realm of possible, how do we get to the same goals, but maybe a slightly different way, and how you legislate. And so, lesson learned. And so now it's a lot more effort is going into not just on behalf of the companies, because that's all lens of companies, but a lot of other groups. I think we'll see that there's a lot of think tanks that are great think tanks, AI Now, Data in Society, there are a lot of folks that are thinking long and hard about a lot of these sorts of issues in the intersection of technology and policy, and they're all working on how do they go about helping to educate members as well. So your point's
But a lot of the
extremely well
members
taken.
are,
But a lot of
the members, I can think of like Senator Warner, Senator Klobuchar, Senator Bennett, Senator Will Hurd, Ro Khanna. There's lots and lots of people. I mean, we can't do anything about Ted Cruz, but that's the way it is. Like, he's really stupid, like, about this stuff. And he keeps tweeting today. He 26. I almost was like, stop talking, because you don't know what you're talking about. But many people are highly intelligent about this stuff. I think that's not as big a problem as was displayed there. I don't know if anyone else disagrees with me. I don't think they're stupid.
Hello, thank you all for being here. So it seems to me like the Supreme Court has been lagging behind in addressing advancing technology's constitutional impacts with respect to police surveillance methods. Last year in the Carpenter ruling, the Supreme Court essentially said in a 5-4 ruling that police need a warrant to access people's cell site data, but it took them nearly 2 decades to reach that. And Justice Kennedy even said, and I quote, "The Supreme Court risks error by elaborating too fully on the Fourth Amendment implications of emerging technology before its role in society has become clear." So since the Patriot Act, there have been about 4 million violations of Fourth Amendment rights with respect to cell site data. So my question is, how do we prevent this from happening in the future? And would any of you advocate for the European model where there needs to be a statute that approves or allows these new types of police surveillance before they can use them?
I guess that's for me. Let me look at the glass half full side of this. Since 2012, the Supreme Court has considered digital privacy in 3 cases, and each time it has issued a landmark Fourth Amendment decision expanding privacy rights in the digital age. And after the Supreme Court treated the Fourth Amendment like a dish rag during the war of drugs, to see the Fourth Amendment being rejuvenated is actually something that we should celebrate. So in 2012, the Supreme Court said that when the FBI attaches a GPS tracker to a car, that's a search under the Fourth Amendment. In 2014, they said that the search incident to arrest doctrine doesn't apply to cell phones and smartphones. And then in the Carpenter case, they sort of took aim at this third-party doctrine under which the rule had been if you share any data with a third party, you waive constitutional protection over it. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's not the case. So, and I think actually what's going on here is that the court sees itself in these technologies in a way that it didn't in the drug cases in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And you even saw this in the Jones argument where Chief Justice Roberts asked the government's lawyer, are you essentially saying you could put a GPS tracker in my car in the Supreme Court garage and track my location indefinitely? And the government's lawyer said, well, that would be no different than having teams of FBI agents follow you around, which was not a great answer, but was the most honest answer. And of course, they all use smartphones. They all use this technology. Yes, I mean, I think that you also identified something correct, which is that law enforcement starts using a surveillance technology, and there's a big lag before we get into the courts. And one of the ways that we've been trying to address that is, it would be hard to say that there has to be authorizing legislation for every use of technology. But we have been pushing local communities to require local consent to the rollout of police technologies in those communities. So what often happens is that the federal government will push out, military-grade surveillance technologies for free to local communities, and there won't be any, sort of consideration at the local level. Now, I think 14 or 15 American cities, and this effort is expanding, have passed ordinances saying, we will not use any new surveillance technology in our community without having a local democratic process to decide whether we should use it or not, right? So I think that's an important first step. But I do agree with you that for something like facial recognition technology, it's pretty amazing.
It's going to start on the state level.
Yeah, but I mean, the fact that it's being used by police departments without, any authorizing legislation is something that we ought to be worried about.
Yeah, but probably state and local level is where
I think so.
We'll start.
Well, you saw San Francisco banned it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But and you'll see where that goes in the courts and where it happens, and it'll rise to the Supreme Court presumably.
Yep.
Presumably. All right, last question.
Yes, I'm not going to ask the question Roy expects I'll ask. So staying in the law enforcement lane, but going to big data generally as opposed to AI, familial DNA, how it was used for the Golden State Killer and the use of these ancestry databases for law enforcement purposes. Tried to work on policy while I was at Justice. Didn't get it finalized. The panel's
That's great,
thoughts.
because it has lots of implications of lots of DNA of the woman who runs 23andMe and Wojcicki. I asked her what her biggest problem recently was. We just had lunch, and she said she gets calls every day from a donor father who now finds out they have 53 children because they found them and they're pissed because they were no donors.
Yeah.
They're like, whoa.
We're also seeing rapid DNA at the border now.
Yeah,
so I just wanted to add that.
And there's
to the
all
puzzle
kinds of implications. It goes all over the place.
So, Brett Steele, who I worked with at DOJ, I think we actually kind of battled on this issue, because the problem is when you start taking DNA from every arrestee and you don't take it from everybody else, you're ending up just recreating the discrimination and the bias and the lack of procedural justice in the criminal justice system, and that's what's allowed. On an arrestee, you can take DNA from them. You don't have to be convicted of anything. And so when you have police out there who are more likely to arrest a person of color or a person who is poor than someone else, you have a database basically of black poor people who then you will run everything against. So yeah, do you ultimately catch somebody maybe who did something at some point? Maybe, yes, but you are again excluding a whole portion of the population from that database those who choose not to opt in through 23andMe or something like that. So I find it very problematic. And then just looking at local law enforcement, a lot of local law enforcement is really awful. It's really, really awful. And giving them the power to make these decisions is very, very troubling to me. Not that federal law enforcement is always great, but a lot of the sheriffs and police departments that I've dealt with, I do not want them to have the ability to decide who they take DNA from.
All right, I want to sort of end. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think this is a really, really hard one. And, of course, it comes up in a serial killer case right now where we're not going to want to dig beneath the surface. But, I mean, what the police did in this case is that they took unidentified DNA and they created a fake profile on one of these 23andMe-like sites. They actually uploaded somebody's DNA. It was a different one, right?
It?
Yeah, and sort of used that to figure out who that person was related to, and then eventually picked up abandoned DNA from from a suspect, but we might feel comfortable. I mean, uploading someone's DNA to one of these sites is an immense privacy violation that's probably justifiable in a serial killer case, but certainly wouldn't be justifiable for other crimes, right? But if this practice, starts getting used before we really think about it, I would also say that the sort of abandonment doctrine that we have for DNA, where if you leave your Coke can in the garbage can, you've waived your privacy rights over that, was developed in an era where DNA was much less revealing than it is right now. And that Coke can is not just revealing your genetic code, but everyone who's related to you and everyone who hasn't been born who's going to be related
Right, so they
to you.
can link it to you.
That's right.
That's exactly right. All right, I want to end on sort of the idea of, these are all these complex issues. They've brought up here so many of them. What you just very briefly, if you feel sort of optimistic or pessimistic that we started with that idea is, can we get our arms around it? I think one of the things that's really critical to keep in mind is all of you are all responsible for this too, to be aware of what's happening. You give away your data every single day in ways you don't realize, and it's very preventable, and you can also speak up about it and stuff like that. And I don't think the onus should be on consumers necessarily, because I think, you didn't, your tires should work, because the government makes sure they work. You don't have to opt into clean air or clean water, but you should think really hard about all the stuff, all the data you're creating almost constantly, which is going to be used by all these systems. But, and I think I'm optimistic when people get educated about it, they will start to understand, although it shouldn't, again, be the onus should not be on you. But each of you, are you optimistic or pessimistic? Why don't we start here and then go down, about that we can get our arms around this right now?
Very pessimistic, but that doesn't mean you stop fighting.
Oh, I'm very much of a Star Trek future versus a Terminator future.
Right. Are you? Okay. It's usually Star Trek versus Star Wars, because Star Wars is kind of dark. But go ahead.
We're all evading the answer. Constructivist, right? Like, it is what we make of it.
Yeah, look, I think that the trauma for most of us of Brexit and the Trump election have put these issues on the table in a much, much more serious way. And so, if I weren't cautiously optimistic, it would be hard to come to work.
Yeah. I mean, if you think this social media thing is a problem, I think you ain't seen nothing yet. And that's what you have to think about. All right. Thank you so much, everybody.